Here's Tim Cooper.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Thanks. Well, thanks for coming out. I'm pretty excited to be teaching this class for several reasons. Number one, it's one of my absolute favorite things to do, and that is HDR. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But the other reason is I just released a book on this called The Realistic HDR Image. And so this is kind of a nice follow-up to that. And I'll give you guys some more information on that as well. But you know, the reason that I like this so much, I think, is because of where I came from. That's New Jersey. No, I came from the darkroom, you guys. And so my career started working in the darkroom day in, day out, 40 hours a week, black and white printing. And that's the way I got started. And I was constantly trying to figure out how to make better prints, how to get what I saw in the scene. And it was very difficult. Spent a lot of time doing it. And then Photoshop came around. And Photoshop was significantly easier once you learned Photoshop, you know. And that's very troublesome there. But then the HDR programs came out. When they first came out, I scoffed at them. Just learn Photoshop. That's the way to do it. But they quickly got very good. They got very, very good. And so I began using HDR. And the reason is because most of the work that I do really revolves around shooting high contrast scenes. Whether it's outside or whether it's inside, that's the type of work I do. And so HDR became, you know, the program, working in the program became very, very important to me right from the get-go. So the first question is what is HDR? High dynamic range, absolutely. It stands for high dynamic range. And really, folks, this word, people use this in a lot of different ways, right? So HDR could be a program, such as the one I use, called Photomatix. It could also be a file. Some people say, you know, look at my print, it's an HDR image. It's technically not, but that's what we say. It's an HDR image, you know. It can be a photo. It could be a print on the wall. Somebody will say, oh, that's an HDR print. Not technically, but, or people will even say, I'm going to shoot some HDR. And so it's the act of shooting is called HDR. But truly, HDR stands for high dynamic range, and it's either a program or it's a file. Okay? So that's what HDR truly means. Now, when we talk about dynamic range is the difference between the brightest part of a photograph and the darkest part of the photograph. You could also say that dynamic range is what your camera is able to capture with regards to the brightness range of the scene. All right? So when we look at a photograph and we examine it and we look at the darkest part or the lightest part and then the darkest part, what we're talking about is the difference between these two. How many stops difference is there? Is there 4 stops difference, 2 stops difference, 10 stops difference? That's what the dynamic range in the scene is. All right. Now, a lot of times, depending on what you photograph, you could simply make photographs all day long and never need HDR. But other situations call for other actions. All right. So when the dynamic range is too much, your camera can't record detail. And let me tell you what, you guys, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. This has been around as long as film has been around. We've been fighting this problem for as long as I've been a photographer. So we have this problem. Okay, so how do we solve it? So in this image, you can see that I was doing a shoot in this hotel, and we can see plenty of shadow detail in here. You look down into the deepest parts of the image, and we see plenty of shadow detail. But the window, which we feel is pretty important in this case, is sort of blown out. So this has got too much dynamic range for my camera's sensor to tackle. All right? I make another exposure. Now I've got good highlight detail, but my shadow detail is all but gone. Okay, that's a problem. This is a scene that requires HDR. Now, we started off by saying dynamic range, or dynamic range is the difference between the brightest part and the darkest part of your scene. Well, it also refers to what your camera can capture as far as the tonal values that will record detail. So if we look at what's called our indicated exposure meter inside of our camera, you'll typically see a 0 to a -1, -2. Most cameras stop there. +1 to a +2. And again, most cameras stop there. But more expensive cameras will often come with a +2 and a +3. Well, right there is what we call our latitude, or our dynamic range. From 0 to +2 and 0 to -2. Those are what, in film, we used to call them the textural zones, meaning they would record detail. But not everything, of course, fits into those zones, right? So when we're looking at our indicated exposure meter in our camera, which, by the way, you may not see that. You have to put your camera to that manual mode to get that. If you have it in aperture priority or shutter priority, you may not see this meter. So it's important to shoot in manual because this is going to be our guide, okay? So right there is our textural range, our 5 stops on either side. Now, you may hear or you may have read that some cameras have a much more extended dynamic range. Have you all heard that? Well, that's true to a degree. It's also somewhat of a manufacturer's claim. I don't know if you all ever, is anyone in here old enough to remember Zest soap? Right? Okay, so what was the commercial for Zest soap? Will not leave a film on your body. It's the only soap that ever left a film on my body. I don't know how they get away with this, but this is what they do, right? So I'm not saying Nikon and Canon do that. They're no Procter & Gamble, of course. But, by the way, I don't know if Zest was made by Procter & Gamble. But sometimes they like to stretch the truth a little bit. That's all I'm saying. And while some cameras truly do have some higher dynamic range, like the D800 really shocks me. You can definitely get plenty of detail down here into -3 with the D800, maybe even a little bit further. For the most part, we want to stick within this dynamic range because when we start digging down into these values, what we're pulling up is sort of the dregs of the barrel, right? You're going to end up with a lot of noise, and it's not going to be very pleasing information that we pull up. All right, that's why I like to kind of still teach it the way we always taught it with film, it being the 5 stops of latitude or 5 stops of dynamic range. Okay, anything above that, folks, is going to end up being pure white with no detail or pure black with no detail. Okay. Now, primarily, we're going to use HDR to capture the full tonal range in the scene. The reason I say that is because HDR can be considered a bit of a fad. I know a lot of people I talk to will say, well, you know, you might want to use HDR for that. Oh, I'm not going to, you know, that's not my thing. I don't do that. It's not so much of a fad. It's not so much of making your image look like a cartoon or super grungy. Although you can do that, that's not really my style. My style is to try to bring it back so it's realistic, so it looks like what I saw when I was standing there. Right? We all pine about we're all concerned about the loss of film and how wonderful film was. Well, one of the things that we liked about film was that it was kind of realistic, right? And with digital, we can manipulate it so strongly that we can get very, very far from reality. So my goal with blending images to HDR is simply capturing all of the detail that was in the scene. Now, I'm not trying to make it look like a cartoon. I'm not trying to make it look grungy. It's not my style. Doing that is quite simple. You don't need my help with that. It's far more difficult to actually make it look realistic, okay? So kind of capturing the whole tonal range, that's what I'm looking for. So here I run workshops down in Zion. We always take a day trip and head down to Antelope Canyon in Page, Arizona, because it is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And but the amount of dynamic range in there is so severe, so that when I expose for the shadows, like the image on the left, the highlights are completely blown out. When I expose for the highlights on the right, the shadows are completely black. There's no way you can capture this in one frame. One exposure cannot do it, right? So it takes multiple exposures. If I remember correctly, this was either 6 or 7 exposures. I'm not quite sure. And so these are 2 of the images that I shot out of the series, and then I blended the entire series together to get this. Now we have detail in the shadows, and we have detail in the highlights. But I think what's equally important about looking at this image is noticing the fact that the shadows are still dark, as they should be. The highlights are still bright, as they should be. One of the biggest problems, and we'll see this when we start processing images, one of the biggest problems is that people compress the tones so much that there's no more dynamic range left. We want to keep a bright highlight. We want to keep a dark shadow. We just want to show some detail. That's exactly what that place looks like when you stand there. All right. So our first step, our absolute first step is going to be, hey, do I even need HDR? You don't need HDR in every situation. So what are some of the tools that we can use to determine whether HDR is required? Histogram for one, right, you guys? Histogram is a great tool. So does this image and its accompanying histogram tell you that you need to shoot HDR here? No. What we have is we have the bottom part of that histogram coming right down into the left corner, and the other part of the histogram coming right down into the right-hand corner. This is telling me that I have got plenty of detail throughout the entire image. No reason for HDR here. How about that photograph? Yes. Do you think we need HDR there? Look at the histogram. No, we don't. Yep. So it looks dark in here, but I think even with this, the light on in here, we can see, yeah, you can see plenty of detail in there, right, people? Right in the shadows. And highlights, as far as highlights go, there's not even any really bright highlights in there. Look at the corner of the histogram. The right-hand side does not yet even reach the corner of the histogram. So this scene requires no HDR whatsoever. And this is I think this is a really important thing to pay attention to, because a lot of people will get into certain situations and they'll just think, oh, I have to shoot for HDR. I've got a bracket. You know, and they'll just do it out of hand. And that's just not necessary. So really ensure that you need it before you get started, right? We'll come back to metering and how this is done in a little bit. All right, so to keep things simple, I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to get the proper exposures to blend together in HDR. Let me tell you the way that you don't want to do it. You look at a scene and you say, ooh, that's really contrasty. Auto bracket, click, 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 click. That's what you don't want to do. How many of us have done that before? Yeah, only me? Am I the only one? Oh, okay. It was kind of like, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, we don't want to do that, folks, because that doesn't ensure us that we will have the proper exposures. And the way that I'm going to show you to blend them together, having the exact right exposures is paramount to this process. And when you get those right exposures, creating a realistic HDR image, piece of cake, piece of cake. So getting the exposures is a very, very important part. So one way we can look at this, for all of you that want to set your camera into auto bracket mode, and you want to do spot metering and all this fancy stuff, hang on to your, whatever that expression is. And we'll get to that. Here's just the really super simple way to do it. Okay, first of all, step up to the scene. Take a shot. Do your highlights look good? Nope, they're blown out. Okay, let a little bit less light in. Take another shot. Are they still blown out? Okay, no problem. Let a little bit less light in. Then, when you come up with your shot that has got good highlight detail, that will be your start. Let's just give it a number. Let's just say 1/500th of a second. Okay. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to open up by one stop. And here, folks, you're going to open up on your shutter speed, not on your aperture, okay? Because the shutter speed, well, let's put it this way. The aperture has the possibility of changing the depth of field in your image, and you don't want to do that. Of course, the shutter speed may change motion, but HDR is not really designed for shooting sports anyway. So open up on your shutter speed, okay? And then look at your shadows. Do your shadows look good? Nope, still a little bit dark, no problem. Open up again. Do your shadows look good? No? Okay, open up again. One stop every time. and do that until your shadows do look good. So in this way, you may end up with 2 photographs. You may end up with 4 photographs, or 5, or 7, or 9. It doesn't matter how many photographs you end up with. It only matters that you've got the series with one of the shots good for the highlights and one of the shots good with the shadows, and you're doing one stop in between changed by the shutter speed. All right? That's all that matters. So here is an example series. The very first shot I took is good for the highlights, and you could see detail in that stained glass, and you know from standing in such a place that it's really easy for them to get super bright white. But I shot so that my highlights looked good. Then I took another shot, lower left-hand corner. Of course, the shadows have brightened up because I have opened up a little bit. Then upper right-hand corner opened up a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And finally, when I got to the lower right, I thought, okay, that's good. I see detail here. I'm in good shape now. Those are my 4 shots. And then I'm going to take those 4 shots and blend them together in HDR, right? So let's look at the histograms that go along with these images, all right? So this is the first one. Notice how that histogram is not quite touching the edge. It's very close from touching the edge on the right-hand side. So the right-hand side is your highlights, and the left-hand side is your shadows. So in this image, we can see we have good highlight detail, but our shadows are no good. That's all right. That's our first shot. Okay, then I take another shot. I open up by 1 stop. Okay, now my shadows are starting to creep up the right-hand side in that histogram. I'll take another shot, open it up again, 1 stop. A little bit more detail now, but still touching the left-hand side. And then I shoot my last shot, and now you can see where the histogram comes down into the lower left-hand corner. Now I feel that I've got all the detail that I need out of these 4 shots. Then together, we take them, blend them together in HDR for the final image. All right. So here is the same sort of image. Again, I'm looking at my histogram. So this is the first shot for my highlights. My highlights are good. Here you can see the white of the building. We can see the detail in the bricks there. That's all looking quite nice. And the histogram accurately represents good highlight detail. Does everybody understand that that represents good highlight detail? Okay, excellent. So from here, I open up 1 stop on my shutter speed and shoot. And then I open up another stop on my shutter speed and shoot. And then suddenly, okay, this is it. I've got it. Now I've got shadow detail. But notice how I have not made my shadows so incredibly bright that they've become midtones. I don't want to do that. I want to keep that sense of realism. As we look at this, we know it's darker. That's part of the game. So we take those 3 images and blend them together, and then ultimately you end up with what you've got. So we're keeping it real, folks. We're keeping it real by having this area remain darker and this area remain brighter. That's the key. All right, now, that is the simplest way to shoot. If you guys didn't know anything about metering, if you didn't know anything about manual exposure, you could take the shot, look at the histogram. If the highlights look good, open up a stop, shoot, open up a stop, shoot, open up a stop, shoot. You could do this thing. All right, that's not the absolute best way to go, although it's perfectly fine. A better way to go would be to pre-calculate the exposures so that you know, oh yes, I need from 1/4 of a second to 1/8 of a second, a 15th, 30th, 60th, and 1/125th. Those are my 6 shots. Because then what you can do is you can set your camera up to shoot those shots using your auto bracket mode. You could put your cable release on, you could step back from the camera and just go click, 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 click. Now you're not touching your camera, you're not running the risk of moving the camera in between exposures. All right? And that's about the best way to go. And if you have motion, like a lot of times I'll shoot where the clouds are slowly moving across the sky. And so I think, hey, if I can shoot very quickly, it'll be fine. But if I take my time and click and, then I'm going to get that ghosting. So a lot of times what I'll try to do is shoot them as rapidly as I can, which means setting your camera to the auto bracketing, all right? So what I do is I use manual exposure and I use spot metering. So in a scene like this, what I would do is I'd step up and I'd say, okay, well, what's my mid-tone in here? Blue sky is kind of an average tone. So I'll put it over the blue sky, and then notice the hash mark on the bottom. Right now it says -2. So I rotate my shutter speed dial until it becomes at the 0 point. Does everybody understand what I'm saying now? I'm in manual exposure mode. Okay, well, I'll probably shoot this at a 15th at f8. Let's just see what happens. All right, now I'm going to take my spot meter and I'm going to put it over the highlight area that I want to have detail. And the hash mark moves up to +2. And I think, okay, well, that's within my dynamic range, right? And then I go down to the shadows and it goes down to -2. Do I need to shoot HDR here? I don't. The shot is fine. I could just shoot it at a 15th at f8. There's no problem here. All right, so using the spot meter, I'm going to learn whether things are too bright or too dark. I can place things where they belong. So if we step back, to make this image look normal, what happened was I put my spot meter over the blue and called that average by zeroing out my meter. Okay, now, when my spot meter goes over the white with detail, it's at +2. We just determined that this is going to be a fine exposure for the shot. Agreed, everyone? So, couldn't I say then, if I ever just put my spot meter on a highlight, it should be at +2? Absolutely. Yeah. So I could put my spot meter, I could have started this off by putting my spot meter on the mountain, putting that at +2, and I'd come up with the very, very same exposure. So this is how I work. I find the brightest highlight detail that I want to have, the brightest highlight area that I want to have detail. I'll put my spot meter over it and put it at +2. Okay, so let's see how this rolls. In an image like this, what I would do is I would come down with my spot meter and put it over the bright tones. Now, what I'll do is I'll manipulate my f-stop and my shutter speed, or one or the other, until it says +2. At this point, is that window going to be within the dynamic range? Yes, it is. And it's still going to be bright, because if I put that at 0, what would that window become? It would become an average 15% gray. That's not what a window looks like to us. A window looks bright. So it belongs at +2. Okay, then we end up with a 15th at f8. Okay, so then I'm going to meter my shadows. So I'll take my spot meter and put it over a shadow area, but I don't want that to be 0, do I, people? I want that to be a -2. So I'll manipulate my f-stop and shutter speed and come up with a -2. Now I know I have to capture a 15th at f8, an 1/8 at f8, a 1/4 f8, and a 1/2 at f8. That's 4 stops, that's 4 shots. And those will be the exact correct shots to get a very realistic blend. What I want to do next is I want to go into the program that I'm going to actually show you how to use. That program is called Photomatix Pro. All right? Some of you may have that, some of you may not have it. If you're interested in getting it, then the place you buy it is from hdrsoft.com. Okay? Photomatix Pro from hdrsoft.com. This is the program that I like. I've tried lots of different programs, and it's the one that I feel is the easiest to use and creates the most realistic look. So if you have individual questions about why I don't use your program, I can't really answer that. This is just what I've, come to use. Okay? Now, if you do purchase this, get the Pro version. That will work as a plug-in to Lightroom and Aperture and Photoshop, whatever other programs that you're using. Okay? But also, you're going to get a chance to put in a coupon code. If you put my name in, capital T, capital C, then you get 15% off. So instead of being $99, it comes down to $85. All right. Now, the other thing before we move on is this book, while we're just taking notes here, The recent book that I have is The Realistic HDR Image, and that you can purchase from Peach Pit Press. You guys, it's an ebook. It's $8. It's 85 pages in length. It's absolutely complete. Check it out. Okay, Peach Pit Press, Realistic HDR Image. Okay, so Lightroom, you can work it with a plugin, right? So I'm going to buy HDR, I've got it, and I get the Lightroom plugin with it. You can get it with the Photoshop plugin, Aperture plugin, so on and so forth. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start all my work and finish all my work in Lightroom. Okay, how many of y'all here are using Lightroom? Okay, almost everybody. How many people are Photoshop users? A few. Well, that's just about the rest of you. So for Photoshop users, you're going to begin your work in Photoshop's Camera Raw, ACR, right? Adobe Camera Raw. Now, all the images, or almost all the images I'm going to demonstrate here for you guys today are JPEGs. The only reason that they're JPEGs is I've downsized them and turned them into JPEGs so the processing goes faster, so you're not watching my computer churn. But when I'm working on my images, it's always going to be taking the raw images and bringing them into Photomatix, okay? So let's start off pretty simple. We've got these three images, and let's just take a peek at these three. You're going to see that this first one is the good shot for the highlights, right? The clouds look nice. All this ends up being really, really black. Now, I know what some of you guys are thinking. I could feel it all the way up here. I could feel it. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, hey, there's some detail in there. I could pull that up inside of Lightroom. Yeah, you could. You could. But it's not going to be great detail, you guys, and it's going to look grainy and noisy. So try to resist that temptation. So what I did was I opened up a stop and then I shot this photograph. A little bit more detail. Then I opened up and I shot this photograph, and this represents what I want my shadows to look like. So there's really no reason for me to lift up these deep dark shadows that do not look very good to be as bright as this, when I could just make the exposure for that. Capiche? We good? All right. Now, just to give you guys an example of that, let me show you this example here. This is a photograph where I could come in here and actually take my shadows and brighten them up, right? So if I was to do this thing and I take my shadows and I brighten them way up, and maybe take my exposure and brighten them way up, you know what, that's actually going to be too dark. So let me use another example. Let's say maybe this example, or this one, that's even better. All right, see how the shadows are still dark here, but I could take them and brighten them up a whole lot. What I want you guys to notice is look at what happens to that detail in there. Do you see that? That's what I'm talking about when I say you're reaching down to the bottom of the barrel and pulling up the dregs. It just doesn't look very good. That's why I want you all to resist the temptation of just cranking up your shadows and making them a lot brighter. All right? So let's go then back to our first three images that we're going to blend together. And there they are. What I'm going to do is, in order to invoke Photomatix, I'm going to go to File, Plug-in Extras, and Export to Photomatix Pro. This set of directions will, of course, come with Photomatix Pro. They'll tell you where this is going to be. But that's how you're finding this particular plugin. Okay? Now, after that, you guys, I'm going to be using the shortcut that I created for this, so I don't have to go through that step every single time. But that is under File, Plug-in Extras, Export to Photomatix Pro. Now, once we get this heading into Photomatix Pro, we're met with an intermediary box that says, hello, Tim, what do you want to do with these images? And let's just zoom in here so we can see this a little bit better. You're going to see that the first option is Align Images, and it's checked. I think that's mighty nice of them. Thank you. Yes, I would like you to align my images. I always leave that box checked. You're going to leave it checked as well. Now the next box down is for this gentleman who doesn't like the tripod, and that's you could choose you could choose your hand holding, or you can choose taking on a tripod. And this is a little bit different, you guys. They're using two different engines to align the images. One assumes that it's only going to be moving, one way or the other, and the taken on a tripod, obviously it can be anywhere. So it's a little bit more of a robust sort of algorithm to put them together. But if you're on a tripod, just go ahead and choose the tripod one. Okay. Now, next one down, show options to remove ghosts. We'll get into that. We'll come back to that a little bit later. All right. Next option down, reduce noise. Well, this is entirely up to you folks. I try to always shoot as much as I can at a low ISO, 100 or 200. So I almost never check that box. Okay. If, however, you are hand-holding, and you're trying to just grab this shot and you set it up to 1600, why then you might want to have Photomatix reduce your noise, okay? I prefer, if I had to fix my noise, I would prefer to fix it in Lightroom first. One of the greatest things about Photomatix, this program, is that it allows you to make adjustments to your photographs before they go into the Photomatix program. Not all HDR programs allow this thing. So this is a really big benefit as far as I'm concerned. So what I'll do is fix the noise on all of the images equally in, in Lightroom, then send them into HDR, okay? And the same goes with chromatic aberration. It says reduce chromatic aberration, right? Here, you're gonna want to ensure that you fix this somehow. Chromatic aberration is where you have, when you have light passing through a piece of glass, it's ultimately going to break up into its different colors. And then hopefully those colors are refocused to the exact single point on your sensor. If they're not, you get a slight misalignment of colors. And that will result in like a little pink edge or a little green edge. And because Photomatix and the HDR process are so dependent upon really good edges, that chromatic aberration can just get exacerbated by the program. So I always fix all of my chromatic aberration before I ever send my images into HDR. So these two are going to be largely dependent on whether you fix them first. Okay, I fix them both in Lightroom, so there's no reason for me to check those boxes. Okay, coming down, automatically re-import into Lightroom library. Sure, that sounds like a good idea. That means I'm going to start in Lightroom, go to Photomatix, fix it in Photomatix, and when I hit save and re-import, boop, it pops back up in Lightroom for me. Awesome. Okay, next down, file name. Well, you could change the file name if you want. I don't. It's largely irrelevant. You could do whatever you want there. Does not matter. Okay. Then down here we have output format, 16-bit TIFF. Well, our choices are JPEG, 8-bit TIFF, or 16-bit TIFF. We know what JPEG is, right? That's going to be a compressed file. We don't really want to get into that. We may want to make alterations to our photograph afterwards. So JPEG, no good. All right, TIFF 8 or TIFF 16-bit. Well, there, all you have to remember, if some is good, more is better. Give it 16. That's going to be a nice, rich file filled with information that will withstand plenty of other adjustments back in the program. Okay? So, once all that is set, this remains sticky, folks, which means this is going to be just this way when I come back in next time. So I'm going to hit export, and Lightroom is off and running, and it's going to bring these images together. All right, now, this is our work environment for Photomatix. Here we have a thumbnail strip. Here we have our image window. And here we have the ability to make adjustments. Now, this thumbnail strip can be, it could be tempting. It could be like a bad drug, you guys. You want to stay away from this thumbnail strip, right? You don't want these sorts of images. This is that fake painterly look that we don't want. So these are just simply presets that for the most part are god-awful, all right? So probably the smartest thing that you can do is as soon as this screen opens is go ahead and just close that out. Get rid of it. Get rid of it, people. You don't want to look at it, all right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit this fit screen, so now my image is full-sized in here. Okay, let's get that away because that is just devastating. All right, now, in HDR, what we have, once we get into the HDR program, folks, what is actually happening is it's taking the files that are coming in and it's putting it into a much bigger space, what's called a 32-bit space. And at that point, you've got all the information in your file. You've got all the information in your file, but we now have to place it into visible tones. Does that make sense to you guys? Right, now here's this huge dynamic range that we captured, but the camera can only see this much. Well, guess what? That's what prints can see, and that's what your computer monitor can see too. It's pretty close, right? But we have all these tones. So now that they're in this one big file, we need to make the brights a little bit darker so we can see them, and make the darks a little bit lighter so we can see them. Basically what we're doing is we're mapping these tones into a new space. How does that feel? We're mapping them into a place where we can see all of the tones. All right, that's called, well, tone mapping. Now, there's two ways we can do this. There's an actual button up here called tone mapping. And then there's the button down here that says exposure fusion. Let's just go through this really simply, you guys. I want to make this as simple as I can for you guys. Tone mapping, bad. Tone mapping, scary. All right? Now, watch this. Exposure fusion, good. Exposure fusion, warm, welcoming, easy to understand. Now, what I often like to do when I'm blending together, and I'm being facetious, of course, because there is times for tone mapping for some people, but if you want to create a realistic HDR image, tone mapping is going to be far more difficult to achieve that goal. All right, there's some advantages to it, but not for what we're talking about today. All right, now, what I often like to do is just look at Lightroom behind my image. And look at that, you guys. Don't they look remarkably similar, except I now have detail here where I didn't have detail before? That looks just like the real deal over here. There's no cartoon element to it. There's no grunge element to it. It's just what it should look like. And that's what exposure fusion can give us. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit exposure fusion, and then I'm going to go down here where it says method defaults, and I'm going to click on that, and that's going to reset everything to those default settings for exposure fusion. Now, let's take a peek. The clouds look a little bit brighter than they do in the darkest image, and the shadows look a little bit darker than they do in the brightest image. So we're close. I haven't done anything yet, by the way, except for hit exposure fusion defaults, but we're close, and that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. All right, so now we have the opportunity to make some changes. But before we make some changes, why don't we go ahead and look at a histogram. So I'm going to go under View, 8-bit histogram, and looks pretty good, doesn't it, you guys? That's what exposure fusion does. It tries to give you a really natural looking histogram. Okay, that doesn't mean that we can't press it. That doesn't mean that we can't make some extra adjustments. So the only downside I feel to this particular piece of software, and indeed all of the HDR software out there, is that they really name these things, It's like engineers are naming them. It's like the photographers are not naming them, you know? So they don't make sense to us. We don't have any strength slider in Photoshop or Lightroom, all right? We don't have a brightness and a midtone slider. That's confusing to me. Those are the same things, right? So we've got to work through these a little bit, and it's not that hard. Think of strength as being your, sort of your master fade. So the effect that we're trying to do here, you guys, is darken down the highlights and lighten up the shadows. That is the effect that we're trying to do. Agreed? All right, now, all of these other sliders that we're going to use are going to affect where those tones go. Now, as a whole set of those sliders, this will increase all the power of that or decrease all the power of that. So this decreases and increases everything below it. Okay, so a little bit strange that it's at the top, but there it is. All right, now, the main things that we want to think about truly are our highlights and our shadows, and then our blacks and our whites. Now, I don't know why they just didn't name this highlights and this shadows and this black and white. It would be much easier for us, but they didn't. So the brightness really affects the highlights and the midtones. So you can see, if you look at the histogram, as I make changes here, the brightness is kind of working on those highlight values. Can you all see that? All right, the midtones tend to work on more of the shadows and the midtones. See how the highlights are not being quite as affected? All right. Then the black and white clip will actually just move your deepest blacks and your brightest whites. So those are the 4 settings that we're going to play with. So in this case, I might want to maybe brighten up my shadows just a little bit here. So I might take my midtones and pull them up a little bit. And you can see it really doesn't affect the highlights that much. Okay? Then I could come to my brightness and move that down just a little bit, and that will darken down the sky. Now, none of these did exactly what I want, so now I'll take the strength and push that even further. And now you can see what's happening, right? The shadows are brightening up. Okay? Now, in this image, that's just about all I would do. But if I wanted to move this section of the histogram over, that would be my black clip. Makes the deep blacks blacker. And unfortunately, there's no way to move the bright whites any darker, because the only thing they're going to do is make them whiter, and that's something we don't want. All right? Now, this is a very, very important point that I want to get across to you all. If you do nothing more than open this image, hit Exposure Fusion, and hit Method Defaults, and that's all you did, and then you hit Save and Re-import right here, you'd be way ahead of the game. Way ahead of the game. Now, let's see what just popped up back in Lightroom. Let's go to the Develop module here. And let's see what we've got. Okay, there's the image that we just blended together. All I did was hit Exposure Fusion and Default. And now if I feel like my highlights are a little too bright, we know where that is, you guys. Just take, whoops, I think that's the wrong image. There we go. All I have to do is take my highlights and move them down a little bit. If I want my shadows a little bit brighter, I move them up a little bit. And that's it. The thing about this is that Photomatix has done such a good job of blending and keeping this real looking that even if there's just a few subtle changes, that is so easily done back in Lightroom or back in the RAW converter or back in Photoshop. Too many people try too hard to get it exactly right in Photomatix, and it takes a lot more time, and it's not always intuitive, right? Back here it's super intuitive, but because we're sending it back as a 16-bit file, it's completely resilient to such subtle adjustments. No harm done whatsoever. Okay, so let's look at a few other images, you guys. Let's go to, where are we here? Is this it? Yeah. All right, let's go to an image like this. Here we have our 4 images, and you can see that once again, this is very, very common for me. I'm shooting at the early and late parts of the day where the shadows are really soft and the background is under some really nice setting sun. Okay? One photograph is not going to contain all the detail. So I'm going to take these 4 and blend them together. So what I'll do is with those 4 selected, I'll go File, plug in Extras, Export to Photomatix Pro. This is all the same, so I'm not going to make any changes here because it's sticky. So I'll now hit Export. It goes into Photoshop. Aha, what is this? Well, what's happened here, you guys, is Photomatix is a little bit confused because it recognizes the fact that I have 2 of the shots at the same exposure. Okay, and it says 2 of your images have the same exposure information according to the EXIF metadata, Tim. That's what it's saying. And at this point, this can alert you that you've grabbed the wrong images to bring in. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's why I put this up here. Now, that being said, if you make mistakes in the field, as I did on this particular image, I missed a stop. And so what I did was I took one of the images and duplicated and then darkened it down a little bit so that I would have the 4 stops that I wanted. Okay? But the main reason I wanted to show you that is that you can actually make a mistake in pulling the images in, and it will certainly alert you to that fact. Okay? So let's bring those images in again. And we'll hit Export, and we're just going to go ahead and say OK to that. And we'll blend these images together. All right, so once again, I get rid of that nasty business over there. And I hit Exposure Fusion and Method Defaults. And I think you guys can see that without doing really anything else, we're pretty darn close to where we need to be. Colors are a little bit saturated. That's something we can take care of later. It's not a problem. All right, but you do have color saturation here that you can move down a little bit if you feel like that's something you want to do. All right. So if you bring the right exposures in, the blending in here is going to be effortless. That's the key. That's the key. But yes, I could bring up my strength. That's going to darken down my highlights, open up my shadows. I could bring my midtones up a little bit if I felt like doing that. And you always have your histogram to guide you, right? So it looks like here, I'm not even getting any very pure whites, right? So I might take my white clip and bring that up a little bit. And that may give my image a little bit more openness, make it feel a little bit more brighter, a little bit more bright, rather. And then same thing with the black clip. I can even bring that down a little bit to get that contrast going. So once again, let's look at this, and then let's look at method defaults. And they're just subtle little tweaks in there, you guys, right? Subtle tweaks. I could easily accomplish that, all of that, by hitting Save and Re-import and going back into Lightroom to work on the actual image. And there's that image, and if I felt my shadows needed a little bit of lightening up, I go to the Develop module, and I lighten up my shadows until they feel like where they should be. Okay? If that green feels too saturated to me, I can come down into my saturation in my HSL panel, click on my direct selector button, click on that green, and just desaturate that green only to make it feel a little bit more realistic. All right. Okay, so let's look at a few other images here. Bringing the right images is so incredibly important. Okay, so here I've got 3 images. The first one I think looks good for my highlights. Second one looks good for my midtones and probably my shadows. And this one, well, I don't know. That just feels a little bit too bright overall to me. So let's take these images and blend them together in Photomatix and see what happens. When I hit Exposure Fusion and Method Defaults, the image feels too bright, doesn't it, you guys? Now, I could go and mess around with this. You're certainly welcome to do that. Or you could also follow my lead. When I run into a situation where it doesn't work right out of the box, I just quit. I am a quitter. The problem here, you guys, is I think that this is too bright. And if you add something in that's too bright or something in that's too dark, it's going to influence the mix. So now let's remove this and just blend these two images together. And I think immediately we're going to see the blend is going to be much better. So Fusion Natural and Method Defaults, and there you have it. And you can see that it already looks much more realistic. Agreed, everybody? All right. So I saw your hand back there. Just wait 1 second and I'll open it up to questions. Likewise, well, no likewise, that's it. Put the right images in and you're going to have a much easier time of working with it. Now, once again, I'll just go ahead and hit Save and Re-import back here. And this will pop up inside of Lightroom and we'll move to that image. And there it is. Now, if I feel my highlights are still a little bright, oh, well, I'll just go to my highlight slider in Lightroom and bring that down a little bit. And maybe my shadows, they're looking pretty good. Let me go back up to these highlights here and drop them down a touch. All right, you guys, is that making sense? So now it's just a much easier way to make it look realistic. All right, now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I like most about Photomatix is that it allows me to make changes to my images beforehand. I find that the adjustments that we can make inside of Lightroom or the Adobe RAW Converter are very intuitive. We understand what to do there. However, I think as you can see, they're not incredibly intuitive inside of Photomatix. So let's take these images here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually reset these to ensure that these are all reset to where they should be. And we'll look at these images. This is with Slot Canyons down in Page, Arizona. And you can see the one on the left has got highlight detail. I think we can all agree on that. The one on the right has got plenty of shadow detail. Okay, so in theory, this should be an absolute perfect blend. Look at this. Look at my highlight detail here, you guys. Look how good that is, right? And then I go to my shadows. And look at that. Plenty of shadow detail here. All right, so let's blend these together and see what happens. All right, Fusion Natural, Exposure Fusion, and Method Defaults. All right, my whites look a little blown out there. That concerns me. All right, so let me take my brightness and pull it down some. Oh man, as much as I pull that brightness down, I'm not really getting too much more detail in there, especially since I'm going to have to go back with my midtone and open it up. I'm meeting resistance. I don't like it. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to quit. Seriously, that's enough. If I hit that much resistance, I'm done. I don't want to play around with it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Lightroom, and I'm going to take this darkest image that should have good highlight detail in it, and it does. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the Develop module, and I'm simply going to take my highlights and bring them down just a little bit, and then I'm going to bring my whites down a little bit. Then I'm going to go to the next darkest one, and I'm going to bring those highlights down a little bit, and those whites down a little bit. All right, now let's reblend this. So File, plug in Extras, Export to Photomatix Pro, and hit Export. Photomatix is recognizing the changes that I've made to these images, and it's incorporating it into the final blend. All right, so now when I hit Exposure Fusion and Method Defaults, I don't know, I think we're already on our way, don't you guys? Look at that, I'm still retaining highlight detail in here. If I take my midtones and brighten up those shadows a touch, I still have some highlight detail in there. I could bring my brightness down a little bit and maybe even increase my strength. And now we have greatly altered this scene and retained that good highlight detail. All because we just went back and did some pre-adjustments to the images before they came into Photomatix. Does that make sense, everybody? That's the primary reason I like this program. right there. So let's take this example here. Here we've got image where I've got good highlight detail out here and then all the way to good shadow detail in here, right? Now, if I blend all these together in Photomatix, let's see how this comes out. Very noisy out there.
Well, that means 6.
6 images, yep. Now, the truth of the matter is, you guys, is that this image here is probably too dark for the outside, okay? So I hit tone mapping and I hit defaults just to see what happens. All right, do you notice how bright it is in here and how dark that is out there? That doesn't look realistic. And it doesn't have a nice wide dynamic range to it. So when we go to exposure fusion and then hit method defaults, immediately it feels much darker in here, as it should. We want that feeling of being in this tunnel looking out. And I would say that that's even pushing it for being darkened down too much. In my mind, that's a little too dark. All right, so what I'm going to do is quit, because you guys know how much I love quitting. And I'm going to go to the grid mode, and I'm going to pull out that darkest one, which is this one. That was at 1 second. So I'm going to pull that one out and then reblend them together. Any day now. All right, now we hit exposure fusion and defaults, and now this is brighter. That's starting to feel more realistic to me. All right, I'm going to take my brightness and make this even a little bit brighter like that. And then I'm going to open up my shadows just a little bit with my midtones. Now I feel like, because this isn't a dark tunnel, I really should have some snappy, deep blacks, right? I want some good, deep blacks in here. So I might even take my black clip and move that over a little bit. Now, would you agree that that feels like you're in that tunnel looking out? So it's the idea that having this area be too dark, having our brights being pushed down so far that they become a midtone, it starts to lose that sense of reality. Okay, so in this case, I ditched the darkest one and then some subtle manipulations in here to make it feel better. All right, so ultimately what we have to ask ourselves, you guys, is when we're looking at, did I bring it in here? Oh, shoot, I don't think I did. When we're looking at an image in HDR, what we want to do is we actually want to try to use our words to figure out why things look fake. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and blend these 4 images together, looking right into a sunset. And let's see what happens here. If we go to tone mapping and hit method defaults here, why does that look fake, you guys? Can anybody tell me? Look at the highlights. Yeah, first of all, the highlights here are as bright as the foreground. That's insane. That would never look that way. Also, look at how saturated this is. Highlights are never that saturated. That's not the way we see the world. And also, it's about as dark here as it is like right over here. The sun doesn't work that way. It's always going to have a glow that fades off, right? So when we go into exposure fusion, and this one, I didn't quite make enough exposures to make this right. But if we go into exposure fusion, hit method defaults, look at how that sky looks different, you guys. It's brighter here, it gets darker and darker, and as it gets darker, you start to get more saturation. That's in the highlight values. The shadows are clearly way darker than the sky. Well, that's pretty natural. But let's take the strength on this and crank it up. And let's take our midtones and brighten them up some. And that is going to be a little bit closer as to what it looks like. All right, now I'm going to notice how my histogram here, you guys, does not show any deep blacks right here. You generally do not want that. So let me take those blacks and move those over a little bit. Now that looks much more like the scene as if it was shot on film and the camera was capable of capturing it all. Now, of course, you can stylize that a little bit more if you want, no problem, but we just don't want to push it to those degrees that we saw when we first opened it. That's going to be the problem. So a lot of times just examining that and asking yourself, why does that not look real? How does it really look in real life? Those are the kind of questions that once answered will help you guide your image making in here. All right, so let me show you a cool addition to Lightroom here, or I'm sorry, to Photomatix. A lot of photographers were asking for a way to work with their architectural images. So the folks over at Photomatix kind of fixed it up. So let's take these 3 architectural images and let's blend them together in Photomatix. Now, here you can see we have really bright highlights, right? Well, let's hit exposure fusion and method defaults, and we don't quite have the highlight detail we want. Now, let me take this, and instead of using Fusion Natural, which we have been using, let's go to Fusion Real Estate. Now, look at how the sliders have changed, you guys. These sliders, to me, are a little bit more intuitive. Shadows, highlights. Ooh, I get that, right? If I want to darken down my highlights, I could pull my highlight slider to the left. If I want to get more contrast or detail in the highlights, I can go highlight depth. And shadows will lighten or darken the shadow areas. So this can be very helpful when you have a lot of open windows and you're viewing to the outside, right? Because I'm starting to think that some of these images were adjusted, and that's why that example didn't turn out as well as it should have. Did I? No, they're all right there. Okay, but at any rate, I find that with exposure fusion, you get more control over the shadows. With Fusion Real Estate, you get more control over the highlights. So let's look at these 4 now blended together in Fusion Real Estate. What? Aha, see, it gave me a warning. I was probably trying to choose something I already blended. Images do not have the same width and height. You know what? That makes me sad. Let's see what's happening here. I probably cropped one and didn't crop the other. Oh, look at that. Yep, that's the one that shouldn't be in there. All right, so let's take these 3 images and blend them together. Now, I just made a whole brand new folder, and I'm hoping I didn't grab the wrong images. I think I may have. Ah, here we go, no. Okay, so Fusion Natural, method defaults, and then watch the highlights. Fusion Real Estate, method defaults. Do you see that, you guys? Now we actually have more control over how dark we can make these highlights. So if I bring my highlights down or up, look at how much they're changing, you guys. Watch the depth. This gets really crazy. Look at that. All the way up to there or all the way down to here. So with the highlight depth and the highlight slider, you have a lot of control over exactly how bright you're going to make your highlights. Now, that being said, I find we have a little bit less control over our shadow area, like we did in Fusion Natural. So now what I've done is, now that they've come out with this version, I'm tending to use the Fusion Real Estate when I need more highlight control, and Fusion Natural when I need more shadow control. Make sense, people? Okay. One last thing before we make this a wrap. Let's see how ghosting works. Here I've got this series of images where I was photographing in this bar, And the bartender has moved. You can see the 3 different positions that he's moved in. If I blended these images together, I would get a little bit of ghosting in each one. So we can avoid that, and this is again one of the major reasons I use Photomatix. This is far superior than what Photoshop does. So let's take these 3 images and blend them together into Photomatix, but this time, before I go any further, I'm going to choose Show Options to remove ghosts, and then click Export. All right, now I'm going to get an intermediary screen where I can say, this is the ghosted portion, fix it. And here you can see this is the ghosted portion, right, you guys? So you can see the arm moving, and this is generally undesirable. So it actually tells you exactly what to do here. Drag your mouse over the image to select the ghosted region. Oh, okay, very well, let's do that thing. So I'm just going to drag a little circle around the gentleman. And now it says control click or right click to mark it as ghosted. Okay, so I'm going to right click inside and mark selection as ghosted. Okay, now if you're following the lines down, step 1, step 2, step 3 would be to preview your deghosting. And that's what it's going to look like. Pretty sweet, right, you guys? Now we can just simply click OK. And now this is going to get sent back into Photomatix proper, and we would continue with the blending process just as we've been doing all afternoon. So let's try this one last example here. We'll return to Lightroom, and let's choose this one. And here you guys can see that once again, I seem to have this problem with unruly wait staff, right? They're moving all over the place in here. Bloody hell. What's going on here? All right, so here, they're just a big blur. Here, they're kind of blurred and kind of still, but that's the shot I want. Because the guy with the red tie is kind of still and the other guy is moving. That's giving me the sense, the feeling that I want. I want some still, some motion. So I want that particular image. All right, so let's blend these together. Show options to remove ghosts. Click Export. And once again, we come to our screen and we're going to circle the area. Now I got to go way out here because there's some movement out there as well. All right. Now the only thing is I can't just deselect this, and that kind of bums me out because I wanted to grab this area as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark it as selected and then right click again and remove selection. So that's, to me, something that could be addressed and fixed. But let me make my circle a little bit bigger. There we go. Now I feel like I've got that whole entire area. Okay, so we right click inside the selection, mark it as ghosted. Now, if we go back again, we could set another photo for selection, and here they are. It's saying, which one do you want to use? And it actually, by default, chose the one I wanted, but it very easily could have chosen another. So if I wanted a different one, I could go to the 0. And when I preview deghosting, it gives me that. I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is go to return to selection mode and right click inside, set another photo for selection and choose that one, and then hit preview deghosting, and now I've got the ones that I wanted in there. All right, so once again we click OK and we get here into exposure fusion, and we can make the changes as we see fit. Let me go to Fusion Natural and method defaults, and that's pretty good. I might want to open up the shadows a little bit there with the midtones, but that's about it. Looking pretty darn good. All right. So not only can we control the tonal values, but we can also control what area we can fix for being ghosted. And like I said, I have seen plenty of other programs that do not work as well with that ghosting. This one works quite nicely. My book actually covers all of this and a lot more. So it goes into all the presettings that I do in Lightroom. It goes into how to spot meter, you know, things that I just touched on in here. It goes into much more depth than that. And then of course, multiple examples on how to process your image in Photomatix. Oh, and also it shows you how to blend it in Photoshop and then bring it back to Lightroom to do the tone mapping, which is another option if you don't want Photomatix and you already own Photoshop. How many people own Photoshop in here but don't own Photomatix? Only a few people. Okay. Just so you guys know, you can, all right, okay, I'll show you then. That's fine, let's just do it. Let's just do it, we'll do it. Okay. You can take, let's say these 3 images, or let's go back to, oh, those 4 different sizes. What image do I want to do? All right, let's do these. This would be good. I'll take these images that we saw, and instead of going into Photomatix, which is heresy as near as I'm concerned, but that's okay. Let's do it in Photoshop. We're going to go to Photo, Edit In, Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. All right. Now, these 6 images are now going to go into Photoshop, and we're going to have Photoshop do the blend. But we're only going to allow Photoshop to do the blend. We're not going to allow it to move our tones like we were allowing Photomatix to do. Okay? There's only one trick that you have to remember with this. We want to keep this image in a 32-bit form. All right? So you can see it's taking a little bit longer. I got 6 images. Photoshop is chewing away at this. And we're going to get to a place where we're going to set the white point, and we are going to decide how it's going to be output. Okay, so at this point, what we're seeing is a true and real 32-bit image, which means I cannot see all the detail in here because it hasn't been tone mapped yet. Is everybody with me on this? It hasn't been tone mapped. This is basically Photoshop has just aligned them into a 32-bit file. That's it. So what you can then do is take your white point and pull it over until you feel like your highlights look good, which very typically is right at the end of the histogram. All right, I can fix that later. Now here, excuse me, here I want to choose 32-bit and click OK. And again, this is all outlined in the book. So, like I said, to repeat myself, at this point, Photoshop is just merging the images together and putting them into this really big 32-bit file. We're not allowing it or allowing us to make our changes to what it should look like at this point. Okay, now when we come back into Photoshop, the trick is going to be just to hit Save and Close. And now, when we do that, it'll return to Lightroom. Okay, so I'm going to hit File Save, and then File Close. And it goes back into Lightroom, and here it is. So the question is which now these images actually do look like one another. But this one says Edit TIFF. This was JPEG, 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 JPEG. So I know this is my 32-bit file. Everybody with me? All right, now check this out, you guys. This is like magic. All right, if I go into the Develop module, and let me just pull this back down here, and I'm on my 32-bit image, and I go to my basic panel, suddenly these controls are going to have so much more control over the image because it's a 32-bit file. Now I can take my shadows and I could really just crank them up, right? Or I can take my highlights and really darken them down or really brighten them up. And in this way, you can just do your tone mapping, so to speak, here inside of Lightroom. So if you already own Photoshop, you could just say, listen, Photoshop, do me a favor. Take these images, put them in a 32-bit file, register them, and then let me save it and close it and bring it back to Lightroom. And I can do all the adjusting in Lightroom. It's a really nice way to go if you're not going to use Photomatix. All right. All right, people. That's all I got.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.